Don't you dare knock on that man's door. 7-year-old Malachi Reddick froze with his fist an inch from the wood. His father had said it at the breakfast table 2 hours earlier. 3 days, 3 mornings that porch had stayed empty. 3 mornings Walter Pruitt hadn't lifted 2 fingers off his rocking chair to say good morning. And the old man's toolbox was still sitting out on the step, wet with dew. Walter Pruitt had never once in his life left his tools out overnight.
He waves at me every day, even when it's raining.
Boy, people like us don't go walking into other folks' houses in this town. Not ever.
Malachi went anyway. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked until his knuckles stung. And then, from somewhere behind that door, thin as thread pulled through a needle, "Somebody, please." In the fall of 1938, a proud old man was 2 days from dying alone. The only person in Cordell, Ohio who noticed was 7 years old. Before we go back, if you've ever waved at a neighbor every day and never once knocked on their door, stay with this one, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Bellflower Street ran 4 blocks east of the rail yard, and everybody on it knew everybody else's business. A thing the neighbors said with pride, the way you might brag about a garden. It wasn't true. It had never been true. But it was the kind of lie a street tells itself so it can sleep well. The Reddicks had lived at number 12 for 14 months. They'd come up from Tennessee with 2 trunks, a sewing machine, and a boy who talked to strangers before his mother could stop him. Curtis had gotten on at the Denholm lumber yard. Probationary, they'd said, a word that had already lasted a year. Across the strip of packed dirt they both called a yard stood number 14, Walter Pruitt's house, and he had lived in it since before most of Bellflower Street was born. 2 houses, 2 families with skin like theirs on the whole street, and they faced each other across 40 feet of nothing. Loretta Reddick had noticed it the first day, standing in the empty front room with a box on her hip. Malachi noticed it differently. All he knew was that the old man across the yard raised 2 fingers to him every single morning. Walter Pruitt was 74 years old, and he had a reputation on Bellflower Street, though not the kind that came with invitations. He'd worked 31 years in the coach shop at the rail yard, and when his hands got too slow for that, they turned out to be exactly fast enough for everything else. He sharpened knives. He rehung doors that had dropped in their frames. He resoldered the treadle on Mrs. Aldrich's sewing machine twice in one winter and charged her the same 40 cents both times. Half the street had a story about something Walter fixed. He had rules, and the rules were iron. He never took more than the work was worth. When Mrs. Aldrich tried to press $1 on him, he counted the change back into her palm and closed her fingers over it. And he never accepted food that came without a price. When the Kovacs left a covered dish on his step, he ate it, washed it, and returned it with a repaired latch on the lid. So it wasn't a gift anymore. It was a trade. And he never, in 40 years, owed anybody on Bellflower Street a single cent. There was a reason for that, and it wasn't pride, though pride is what the street called it. At Hargrove's store, Walter paid cash. He counted his money out on the counter and then, every time without fail, counted it again slowly, out loud, where Mrs. Hargrove could see. Not because he doubted her, because he had learned, somewhere in the long years before Bellflower Street, that a man like him should never leave a room where anyone could wonder. He kept his money in a coffee tin on top of the cupboard. He had never once told a living soul it was there. Every morning at 6:30, Walter Pruitt came out on his porch with a cup of coffee, sat down in a rocking chair his own hands had rebuilt twice, and looked at the street. And when Malachi Reddick came out for the milk, the old man lifted 2 fingers off the arm of that chair. That was all. No wave, no word. 2 fingers, and a nod so small you'd miss it if you didn't know to look. The whole street knew how to use Walter Pruitt. Nobody on it knew one thing about it. 6 months before any of this, on a Saturday in April, Malachi Reddick got knocked off his bicycle in the road in front of number 14. It was Denny Kovac and 2 other boys, and it wasn't planned exactly. Denny had got hold of a word he'd heard his uncle use and wanted to see what it did. "Nobody said you could ride down here." Malachi was going too fast to answer. The front wheel caught the ditch lip, and he went over the handlebars into the gravel, and by the time he rolled onto his back with his palms burning, the bicycle lay 6 feet away with its front wheel bent into a shape wheels are not supposed to make. Walter Pruitt came down off his porch. He didn't shout. That was the part Malachi remembered for the rest of his life. He walked to the edge of the road in his shirt sleeves with his coffee still in his hand, and he looked at Denny Kovac the way a man looks at a stripped screw. "Your daddy works second shift at the yard. I know his foreman." He took a sip of the coffee. The 3 boys were gone before he swallowed it. Then he set the cup on the fence post, picked up the bicycle by the crossbar, and carried it into the shed without a word about whether Malachi was coming. Malachi came. The shed smelled like machine oil and sawdust. There was a workbench along the back wall, and above it, on nails driven into the studs, more tools than the boy had ever seen in one place. Walter set the bicycle upside down on the bench, on its seat and handlebars, and spun the bent wheel with one finger. It wobbled like a dropped coin. Wheels not broken. He reached to the shelf above the bench and came back with a small, flat wrench, notches cut into it like a key that had gone wrong. "It's just out of true." Malachi wiped his nose with his wrist and didn't say anything because he was still deciding whether he was going to cry, and talking would have settled the question the wrong way. The old man's hands were enormous and scarred across the knuckles, and they moved along the spokes without hurrying, finding each nipple with the wrench. "A quarter turn. Spin the wheel. Listen." "Same as most things." He spun it again. The wobble had gotten smaller. "Same as most people." It took 40 minutes. When it was finished, the wheel ran so straight and quiet that Malachi asked if it was a different one. Walter didn't laugh. He went into the house and came back with an apple, and he handed it over the way you'd hand a man his wages. "Saturday mornings I true wheels and sharpen blades for folks. 7 o'clock. You want to learn how? Be here." Malachi took the apple. He wanted to say thank you, and he could feel that it would be the wrong thing, though he couldn't have explained why. "You don't have to pay me nothing?" The old man was already turning back to the bench. "You'll pay me, you'll hold the wheel steady while I work, and you'll listen when I talk. And that's the whole price." For 22 Saturdays after that, Malachi Reddick was in that shed at 7 o'clock. He learned to true a wheel. He learned that you sharpen away from the edge, never into it. And he learned that Walter Pruitt took his coffee black and never once talked about himself. The first morning, Malachi told himself the old man had slept late. He stood on his own back step with the milk bottles sweating in his hands and looked across the yard at the rocking chair, and the rocking chair was empty. The second morning, he told himself the old man had gone to town. The third morning, he stopped telling himself things. He stood at the kitchen window with his forehead almost against the glass and counted it out on his fingers, the way he'd been taught at school. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. 3 fingers up, the porch across the way still empty, the milk going warm against his ribs. And then he saw the toolbox. It was sitting on the second step of Walter's porch, right where a man would set it down if he meant to pick it up again in a minute. Oak, dark with age, with a handle worn pale in the middle from 40 years of the same grip. It had been there Monday. It had been there Tuesday. It was there now, and the dew had gone silver all over the lid. Everybody walked past that porch. The postman, the Aldrich girls on their way to school, Mrs. Hargrove twice a day on her way to the store. Every one of them saw an old wooden box sitting on a step. Only one person on that street knew what it meant, because only one had spent 22 Saturdays watching Walter Pruitt wipe down every tool he owned and lock them in that box before the light went. Every time, without exception. Even the morning it rained so hard they had to shout over it. Malachi set the milk down on the counter without putting it away. He told his mother first because his mother was easier, and that was a mistake he understood the second he made it, because his father was still at the table. Curtis Reddick had come off a double at the lumber yard, and there was sawdust in the creases of his knuckles and in the corners of his eyes. He listened to the whole thing, The porch, the chair, the box, with a cup halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down. "You stay in this yard." Malachi had his answer ready. He'd been building it at the window for 20 minutes. "He waves at me every morning, Papa. He didn't wave for 3 days." Old men get sick. Old men go visit people. That is not our business. "But his box is out. He never leaves his box out. Never, not one time." Malachi. The kitchen went quiet in the particular way it did when Curtis used the whole name. He picked up the chisel he'd been carrying in his coat pocket and set it down on the table. And he set it down too gently, the way a man does when he is working very hard not to slam something. You know what happens if a colored man's boy walks into a house uninvited and something's wrong inside? Loretta had stopped kneading. She didn't say anything. She'd heard this before, in another town, about another thing. "They won't ask why you went in, Mal." He let that sit. Out in the street, a truck went by, and neither of them looked at it. "They'll ask how long you were in there." Malachi was 7. He did not understand the sentence, but he understood his father's hands, gone flat on the tabletop, and he understood that the fear in that room was not the kind grown-ups make up to keep children from having fun. Loretta wiped the flour off her forearms and crouched down so their faces were level, and took his chin in her floury hand. "Your daddy's got 1 month of probation left at that yard. 1. And then things are different." Her thumb moved along his jaw. "Can you give me 1 month of staying in this yard?" Malachi looked at his mother, and then at his father, and he nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He did none of the things a stubborn 7-year-old does when he's told no. Loretta went back to her dough. Curtis went back to his coffee. Neither one of them understood until much later that they should have been terrified. Malachi Reddick believed at 7 that broken things could be fixed if you were willing to do the work. He had watched a bent wheel run true again. He had held it while it happened. So he did not go get a grown-up. Grown-ups had already given their answer. He went to work. At 7 o'clock, he crossed the yard with an apple in his fist and set it on Walter's porch step, dead center, where a man coming out his door could not possibly miss it. Then he went back to his own yard and waited, because a Saturday morning apprentice knows the value of waiting. At 8:30, he knocked on the kitchen window, 3 times, then 3 times harder with the flat of his hand until the glass hummed in the frame. He cupped his hands against it and saw a table, 2 chairs, and a cold stove. At 9, he threw gravel at the roof. 6 stones. 7. The last one skittered down the shingles into the gutter and stayed there, and the sound of it landing was the loudest thing on Bellflower Street. At 9:30, he tried the shed. Padlocked. The tools were still up on their nails. He could see the shapes of them through the gap in the boards, and there was no light and no radio and no old man saying, "Hold it steady, don't grip it, hold it." Then he walked back around to the front, and the apple was still there, right where he'd left it. Dead center on the second step 3 hours later, with a fly walking across it. Some things you cannot fix by yourself. Some things, all you can do is go stand next to them. He thought about his father's hands flat on the table. He thought about 1 month, and how long were you in there? And he was frightened in a way he could still describe when he was 70. And then he thought about lying in the gravel in April with his palms burning, and an old man coming down off a porch. He didn't leave me lying in the road. He climbed the steps. He picked up the toolbox first. He couldn't have said why, except that it didn't belong out there, and set it inside the doorway. Then he put his hand on the knob, and it turned. In mouth. Inside, the air was wrong. It was hot and still, and it smelled like a room shut up around something. 3 days of sun on the windows and nobody opening a door. Malachi stood with his eyes adjusting and the toolbox against his shin and made himself keep walking. There were photographs on the wall in frames that didn't match, and a chair with a crocheted cover on the arms that nobody had sat in for a long time. And through the bedroom door there was an iron bed, and in the middle of it, under blankets in 80-degree heat, Walter Pruitt looked like something that had been left out in the weather. He was smaller. That was the thing that broke the boy's nerve. Not the smell, not the breathing. That a man that big had gone small. On the nightstand, there were 3 cups, all of them empty. Malachi ran for the kitchen. The pump handle at the back step fought him. He had to hang his whole weight off it and drop, twice, 3 times, before the water came coughing up out of the spout. He filled the tin cup and carried it back through the house with both hands and his tongue between his teeth and did not spill a drop. He got a hand behind the old man's neck the way he'd seen his mother do with a baby, and he tipped the cup, and Walter drank in a way that was terrible to watch. Malachi held the cup while the old man's hands shook around it. "When'd you eat last, Mr. Pruitt?" Walter's eyes drifted up toward the ceiling, and it took a long time for them to come back down again. "Tuesday. Maybe." The boy's hand jumped and water sloshed out over the blanket, and he didn't notice. "That's 3 days. Mr. Pruitt, that's 3 days. I'm getting my mama." He started to stand, and a hand closed around his wrist. It had no strength in it at all. Those were the hands that had carried a bicycle by the crossbar like it weighed nothing, and now they couldn't hold a 7-year-old's arm. "Don't." Malachi stopped. "Don't bring nobody in here. Not like this." 2 days from dying in that bed, and what he had strength left to fight for was that nobody should see him needing help. Malachi took the old man's hand off his wrist. He was gentle about it. He set it down on the blanket like it was something that could break. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm getting her anyway." He ran, out the door, down the steps, across 40 feet of packed dirt with the screen door banging behind him, and he was through his own kitchen door shouting before it shut. He never did learn to be obedient. Thank God. Loretta Reddick was across that yard before her husband got out of his chair. She hadn't asked her son a single question. One look at his face in her kitchen doorway had told her everything worth knowing, and the rest was just distance. Curtis caught up at Walter's porch steps and stopped there. She went in without him. He stood in the bedroom doorway with his hat still on his head, and something happened in his face that his son had no vocabulary for. Curtis Reddick had spent 14 months in Cordell being careful, counting every step, measuring every word, keeping his boy in the yard. And in all that care, he had walked past that porch twice a day and never once looked up at it. Loretta was already at the window, shoving it open with the heel of her hand. She didn't say, "Oh, you poor thing." She didn't ask how long he'd been like this. She stripped the top blanket off, sent Malachi for a basin, got the second window up, and the fresh air came into that room like something breaking. "Curtis!" He was still in the doorway. "Curtis! Dr. Fenwick! Now!" Walter Pruitt tried to sit up. That was what he did, when he understood there were people in his house. He got one elbow under himself and pushed, and Loretta had to catch his shoulder and lower him back down like a man lowering a beam. His breath came out in pieces. "You shouldn't see me like this." She had a cloth in the basin and she wrung it out without looking at him. That was deliberate. His hand went up to the edge of the blanket and pulled it higher over his chest, over the nightshirt he'd been wearing for 3 days. 40 years on this street. The cloth went onto his forehead. He shut his eyes against it. 40 years, and I never asked a living soul for one thing. Not one. Then don't ask. Loretta turned the cloth over. She was looking at the window frame, at the yard, anywhere but at his face. "Just let me." Malachi stood in the corner with the basin against his stomach and watched the old man stop fighting. It looked like something coming apart. Dr. Fenwick's house was on Ash Street, and it had a front room with a rug in it, and Curtis Reddick stood on that rug for 20 minutes with his hat in his hands. He took Malachi with him, not on purpose. The boy followed him out and kept pace. The housekeeper said the doctor was finishing his breakfast. Curtis said it was an emergency. The housekeeper said the doctor was finishing his breakfast and went away and did not come back. So they stood. Malachi watched the long hand of the mantel clock move because there was nothing else in that room he was allowed to touch or sit on. Twice people came through. A woman with a coat over her arm, a man who went straight up the stairs. Both looked at Curtis Reddick standing in the middle of that rug with his hat in his 2 hands. Both looked away again. Neither said a word. His father did not sit down. There were 2 chairs, and he did not sit down in either of them. That was the morning Malachi learned what his father was afraid of. Not the dark, not being poor, a rug and a clock, and a man standing very still on somebody else's floor, waiting to be allowed to matter. At the 21st minute, Dr. Fenwick came down with his bag. He wasn't cruel. That was almost the worst of it. He was pleasant in the car, thorough at the bedside, a decent enough doctor. He'd just finished his eggs first. Fenwick took a long time with Walter, listening at his chest, at his back, pressing the skin on the back of his hand and watching how slowly it settled. Then he came out to the front room and set his bag on the crocheted chair. "Fever's running high. He's badly dehydrated and he hasn't eaten in the better part of a week." He looked back toward the bedroom door. "One more day and you'd be picking out a plot, not a prescription." Loretta had her arms crossed. She didn't move. "Fluids every hour he's awake. Broth, then soft food when he'll take it. And the medicine is every 4 hours. Every 4, day and night. You miss the night doses, that fever comes back up on you, and I can't promise you anything after that." Curtis was doing arithmetic in his head, and his face was doing it too. "Who does that? In the day I'm at the yard from 6. Fenwick shrugged. It wasn't callous, just a man with 8 other calls. "That's the question, isn't it? He's got no wife. There's the county home over at Ardsley. They've a sick ward." "No!" Everybody turned. Malachi was in the doorway with the basin still in his hands, and he had gone the specific kind of red that comes before crying. "That's 3 towns away. He wouldn't know anybody. He wouldn't know one single person." Nobody corrected him. Nobody told him it was more complicated than that. Because it wasn't. They had it out in the Reddick kitchen with the door shut, and it was not a gentle conversation. Curtis went through it item by item, the way he went through anything that frightened him. Medicine every 4 hours costs money. Broth, milk, coal to keep a room warm for a sick man in October. Loretta, that's money we do not have. We have some. We have 1 month left of probation. He turned away from her and turned back. "And who sits up at 2 in the morning? You? You're up at 5 for this house. Me? I'm on a saw all day. You want me tired on a saw?" Loretta let him get to the end of it. Then she turned the burner off under the pot, and the room went suddenly completely quiet. "He went in there after you told him not to." Curtis stopped. "You sat right there and you told that child what this town would do to him, and he heard you. He understood you. And then he went anyway." She put the spoon down on the stove edge. "He's 7, Curtis, and he already knows what we're supposed to do." Curtis Reddick had made himself small on purpose for 14 months, and it had worked. And now the working of it was standing in his own kitchen looking like a failure. He put his hands over his face. From the stairs came a small voice, from a boy who had absolutely been told to go to bed. "He kept my wheel from being broke." Curtis Reddick started laughing, and it came out wrong, and then it wasn't laughing anymore. He went across the yard by himself that evening and sat on the edge of the iron bed, which put his face lower than the old man's. He did not offer sympathy. He'd worked out by then what would get thrown back at him. "We've got a spare room off the kitchen. Stays warm, and my wife can hear it from the stove." Walter's eyes came around slowly. "No. I'm not finished. It isn't charity. You'd owe me for the room and the medicine both, and I'd expect to be paid." That got him. The old man's chin came up half an inch. "With what? I can't stand up." "Not today, you can't." Curtis looked through the doorway at the tools on the shed wall, 40 years of a man's hands. "I'll bill you when you can hold a hammer." Walter Pruitt was quiet a long time. The lamp on the nightstand made his face all angles. Then he moved his hand toward the cupboard, couldn't lift it far enough, and had to say it out loud instead. "Coffee tin. Top of the cupboard. Take the doctor's money out of it tonight." Curtis found it behind a sack of flour. It was heavier than it had any right to be. There was $91 in that tin. in bills folded twice and rubber-banded by year. Curtis Reddick stood in that kitchen holding it and understood it all at once. The man wasn't poor. He'd never been poor. He had money for a doctor, for food, for coal, for a woman to come sit with him. What he did not have was one single person he could say it to out loud. He carried the tin back to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand where the old man could see it. "Then I'll want it in writing," Walter said. Curtis laughed. It was the first time in 14 months that he had laughed in somebody else's house. Malachi gave up his room without being asked, and then bragged about the cot in the front room for a week. He carried the oak toolbox in from the porch himself, both arms around it and his chin hooked over the lid, and set it at the foot of the bed, squared up, handle out, in the exact spot where a man opening his eyes in a strange room would see it first. He didn't explain why. Loretta watched him do it and didn't ask. The next 2 weeks were run by a clock. 6, 10, 2, 6, 10, 2. Loretta kept the times on the back of an envelope pinned by the stove and never missed one. And twice she woke Curtis at 2 in the morning because her own hands were shaking too hard to measure. Curtis read the sports page out loud in the evenings in a flat, careful voice, and never once asked whether the old man was listening. Malachi talked. That was his entire contribution, and it turned out to be the important one. School and a dog on Ash Street, and whether you could dig a hole to China. On the 4th day, the fever broke. On the 7th, Walter took solid food. On the 12th, he got himself out of that bed and walked to the kitchen with one hand on the door frame and his whole weight on it, and sat down at the Reddick table. Loretta put a plate in front of him without making a fuss, and the 4 of them ate breakfast together, and nobody said one word about it. Walter Pruitt had not eaten a meal at a table with another human being in 11 years. Afterward, Curtis set him in a chair on the Reddick's porch in the morning sun, and old Mr. Aldrich came by on the far sidewalk and slowed and stared and lifted a hand. Walter Pruitt raised 2 fingers off the arm of the chair. A man on a porch is a public fact. Walter sat out there 4 mornings running, and by the 5th, Bellflower Street had worked out what it thought about that. Dr. Fenwick came on the Saturday. He listened to Walter's chest, said the word remarkable twice, and packed his bag. Then he stood on the top step with his hat in his hands and didn't leave. "Mr. Reddick, there's talk at the drugstore." Curtis wasn't wearing a hat. His hands found each other in front of him anyway, and Malachi, watching from the doorway, recognized the position. It was the one they'd held on a rug on Ash Street. An old man with a house and money in it, moved out of his own home into a home that isn't his by people who aren't kin to him. Fenwick had the grace to say it to the floorboards. "I'm not saying it. I'm telling you it's being said. And somebody used the words county and look into it in front of me on Thursday." The screen door banged. Loretta came out with her hands still wet. "Doctor, that man was 3 days from—" Curtis put his hand on her arm. That was all he did. He didn't look at her and he didn't speak, and she stopped. Because they both knew to the penny what it cost a woman like her to raise her voice at a man like him. Then the door opened a second time. Walter Pruitt came out on a cane, 1 step at a time, with a folded paper in his shirt pocket. He had plainly been waiting for this for some while. He handed it over. Fenwick unfolded it. An agreement. Room and board, medicine, coal, itemized. Signed by both men. Dated the 4th of October, 9 days after they carried him across that yard. Witnessed at Cordell Savings by 2 clerks whose names were printed underneath in a bank hand. "Doctor, I have counted my money out loud at Ida Hargrove's counter for 40 years so that nobody in this town would ever have to wonder." He took the paper back and folded it along its own creases. "You came up on this porch to ask them what they were taking from me." The paper went into his pocket. "In 11 years, not one person has come up on a porch to ask me anything at all." Fenwick put his hat on. He said he'd say so at the drugstore, and he meant it, and he did. Then he went down to his car, and Bellflower Street went back to its morning. Curtis stayed at the rail long after the engine faded, and his hands would not stop. You didn't have to do that. Walter lowered himself into the chair. 40 years I kept a paper trail on myself. Every receipt, every job. He set the cane against the arm. First time it ever did anybody any good. On the Monday, Curtis Reddick's foreman extended his probation another 90 days and gave no reason for it. He never told his wife. The story came out at night after the boy was asleep. That wasn't an accident. He'd sit at that table with his hands around a cup until the cot in the front room went quiet, and only then start. Her name was Odessa. They'd married in 1898, and she'd been dead since the spring of 1919, and he told it in the flattest voice imaginable. Influenza. Everybody was burying somebody that year. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the tabletop. I was on a work train 200 miles out. Took me 31 hours to get home, and they'd already closed the box. Loretta reached across, and he moved his hand before she got there. Not away from her exactly, just out of range. I never got to say the last thing, so I quit saying things. He told them how the house went quiet, and how the quiet got comfortable. Then he told them about the door. Saturday night I knew I had a fever. Sunday I couldn't get to the pump. He looked at the tabletop. So I went and I unlocked my front door, left it unlocked. Curtis put his cup down. I've locked that door every night since Odessa, every night for 19 years. But I figured, if I couldn't get up, somebody ought to be able to get in. He did the one thing he still could. He made himself possible to find. Then he lay down in that bed and waited. And for 3 days, on a street where he had fixed half the doors, nobody turned the handle. Loretta had her hand over her mouth. Walter. I wasn't trying to die, he said it quickly, almost impatiently, like a man correcting a bookkeeping error. He turned the cup again, and this time his hand stayed on it. I just stopped seeing what all the trouble of living was for. It was Malachi who found the letters 3 days later, the way children find everything, by looking for something else. He'd been sent for the spoke wrench. He got the box open on the bedroom floor and lifted out the top tray, and underneath was a bundle tied with kitchen string. Envelopes, dozens of them, then more than dozens, every one addressed in the same square, careful hand to the same address in Detroit, Michigan, not one of them stamped. Walter came through that door faster than a man 12 days out of a fever should have been able to move, and for the first and only time, he shouted, "Put those down!" Malachi dropped them and went white, and Loretta was in the doorway in a second, and then the old man's shoulders came down. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees. "I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry. That wasn't for you." Nobody on Bellflower Street knew Walter Pruitt had a son. 40 years of sharpened knives and rehung doors, and not one person on that street could have told you he had a child living. His name was Julius. He'd left in 1927 after a fight about selling the house. He'd wanted his father up in Detroit, in a flat with steam heat near his own children. Walter wouldn't leave the rooms Odessa died in. They both said the things you can't take back. Julius said the last one, that if his father wanted to sit in that house alone, he could go on and do it. And Walter said, "Go." He picked up the bundle and squared it against his knee. 211. His thumb went along the edge of the top envelope where the paper had gone soft and furred from being handled. A man can't write, "Come home," when he's the one that said go. Nobody in that house ever formally invited Walter Pruitt to stay. What happened instead was that one afternoon in November, he walked back across the yard to fetch a winter coat, and he was gone a long time. Loretta finally went to the window. She could see him through his own front room glass, standing in the middle of the floor with the coat over his arm, not moving. The chair with the crocheted arms gone gray with dust. The 3 cups still on the nightstand where a 7-year-old had lined them up. He stood there 11 minutes. Then he shut the door and came back across the yard. Loretta didn't say a word about it. She set a 4th plate at supper the way she had every night for a month, and she went on doing it for the rest of his life. It was Malachi who made it official, straight through the middle of a meal. "Can I call you Papa Walt?" The old man put down his fork. He looked at the window for a while, at the dark yard and the shape of his own empty house in it. When he answered, he had to do it without turning around. "If your daddy don't mind it," Curtis went on eating. "Curtis minds a lot of things. That ain't one." The post office was 6 blocks, and it took them 40 minutes because the old man stopped twice to lean on a fence and pretend to look at chrysanthemums. He wore his good coat, and he'd brushed the collar twice. Malachi walked beside him with the letter in his own pocket, because Walter's hands were unsteady that morning, and neither of them mentioned why. It was one letter, not 211. One, written the night before at the Reddick kitchen table, 4 lines long, and it had taken him 3 hours. At the counter, he bought a 2-cent stamp, set it down on the paper, and pressed it flat with his thumb. Then he pressed it again, and the clerk waited, and Malachi waited, and Walter Pruitt stood there with his thumb on a 2-cent stamp a good deal longer than any stamp requires. "All right," he said, and let it go. Julius Pruitt came down from Detroit 2 weeks before Christmas and stood on the Reddick's porch in a good hat. He was 38, and he had his mother's mouth. Neither man said anything for a while. "You could have written." Walter had the oak box beside his chair. He'd carried it out himself and been waiting the better part of an hour. He got the lid up and turned it so his son could see what was under the tray. "I did." 211 times. Julius looked into that box a long moment. Then he sat down on the top step the way he used to when he was 9 and put his hat on his knee. Later, he asked the question he'd come 300 miles to ask, whether his father would come north now with the flat and the steam heat and the grandchildren. Walter Pruitt nodded out at the yard, where a boy was turning a bicycle upside down on its seat and handlebars, exactly the way he'd been taught. Somebody's got to finish teaching that one. Whatever Fenwick said at the drugstore, he said it well. By the first week of December, there were casseroles. Mrs. Aldrich brought a pot roast. The Kovacs sent a ham with a note on it. People who had walked past that porch for 3 days came to the Reddick's door with covered dishes and the specific bright helpfulness of the recently ashamed. Walter thanked every one of them and ate almost none of it. Mrs. Hargrove came last on a Saturday, and she didn't bring anything. She stood in the doorway with her coat still buttoned. "I saw your box, Mr. Pruitt, out on the step, Monday and Tuesday both." Nobody in the room moved. "I said to myself, now there's Walter's toolbox out in the wet." Her voice went thin. "And then I went and opened my store." That was the moment it turned. Not the casseroles, not the pot roast. A woman in a doorway saying out loud that she had seen it and thought nothing of it, and 11 other people hearing about it by supper and realizing they had seen it too. Walter set his cup down. His hand didn't shake, which was new. "Mrs. Hargrove, I've lived on this street 40 years, and I've been in almost every house on it, and not one of you knew I had a son." She started to say something. He shook his head. "That's not an accusation. That's just the size of it." He looked around the kitchen, at Curtis in the doorway, at Loretta at the stove, at the boy on the stairs who was supposed to be asleep. Nobody ought to be able to go invisible on his own street. So give me something better than a casserole. What he gave them was a rule so simple that grown men argued it couldn't possibly work. At dusk, you put a light on your porch. Lamp, lantern, candle in a jar. Bellflower Street didn't all have electric, and Walter didn't care. Light means I'm all right. And if a porch stayed dark past dusk, somebody goes and knocks. Not tomorrow, that night. That's the whole of it. Walter and Malachi built the first shades themselves, Saturday mornings in the shed, cutting tin cans down and bending the collars over with a pair of pliers out of the oak box. The boy learned to punch a vent hole without splitting the seam. Harold Aldrich told Walter to his face that it was a foolish system, that a man could light a lamp and drop dead an hour later, and where's your rule then? Walter agreed with him. That was the part that shut Harold up. It doesn't have to work every time. He set another shade on the bench. It only has to work once. 3 houses did it that first week. The Reddicks, the Aldriches, and Mrs. Hargrove. By spring, it was 7. By the following autumn, 31. And somebody down on Ash Street had started doing it without knowing where it came from. Curtis Reddick came off probation that March. Nobody at the yard ever said why it had taken 22 months, and he never asked. It never took the whole town. It never does anywhere. Anyone who tells you a story where the whole town changes is selling you something. But on the 9th of February, 1941, the Hessler girl at number 9 opened her door at 9 at night because Mrs. Hargrove had walked over about a dark porch. Behind her, on the kitchen floor, her mother had been down 2 hours with a broken hip and no telephone in reach. Ada Hessler lived another 19 years. Walter never mentioned it to anybody, but Curtis said he kept the newspaper clipping in the bottom of that box, under the letters. He rented his house across the yard to Roy Barlow and his young wife for $4 a month, on the one condition that they keep the fence painted. He kept the shed. He was in it every Saturday at 7 for 6 more years, with a rotating supply of neighborhood children holding wheels steady and being told not to grip it, hold it. Denny Kovac was among them 2 summers running and never apologized and never needed to. Walter Pruitt died in his sleep in the spring of 1945. He was 81. He'd eaten supper at the Reddick table. He'd read a page and a half of the paper, given up on it, and said the print got smaller every year. And when Loretta went in the next morning, the lamp was still on beside him, and there were people in the house. A man who lay 3 days in a shut room where nobody came, and died 7 years later with the light on in a house with people in it. Everything else is detail. Methodist. They buried him beside Odessa on a Tuesday, and the service was at noon. At noon, in bright spring sunshine, 31 houses on Bellflower Street and 11 more on Ash put their porch lights on and left them burning. You couldn't see them. That was the point. Not one showed in that sunlight, and every person who walked that street to the cemetery knew what was up there anyway. Julius came down and stood at the graveside beside a 14-year-old boy, and neither of them said much. Walter had left the oak toolbox to Malachi Reddick, written out in a hand gone shaky, on a page torn from a ledger, and witnessed properly, because of course it was. Inside, on top of the tray, sat the spoke wrench, and under the tray, where the 211 had been, there was one envelope left, stamped, addressed in that square, careful hand to a boy who lived 40 feet away and had never in his life received a letter. Number 212. Malachi never told anyone what was in it. The closest he came in 60 years of being asked was telling his daughter it was mostly instructions. On the headstone, under the name and the dates, the Reddicks put 6 words. He fixed what other people let break. 60 years on, an old man sat on a porch in Cordell, Ohio, with an oak toolbox by his foot, because he had never been able to bring himself to leave it in the shed overnight. Malachi Reddick was 74 years old, which was a number he thought about more than he let on. His granddaughter Tessa was 9, and she had the box open on the boards going through the tray. "Is this the one from the story?" He took the spoke wrench from her and turned it over in his hand, slowly, thumb along the notches, the way a man does when he learned it from somebody who did it that way. "That's the one." She thought about it with her chin on her knees. "Grandpa, did you really save his life?" He didn't answer right away. Down the block a porch light came on, and then another, the way they still did on that street, though hardly anybody left could have told you why. "No, baby." He set the wrench back in the tray. "I just knocked." He did the rest. She wanted more than that, the way children do, the part where somebody's brave. "He was on that street 40 years, Tessa. He fixed everybody's doors, and every one of those people would have told you they knew him." He looked out at the road. "A man can go invisible standing right in front of you. He doesn't have to go anywhere at all." Across the way, a light came on over a door. Malachi Reddick raised 2 fingers off the arm of his chair. "Nobody in Cordell calls it anything now. It's just a thing people on certain streets do at dusk, and a thing they do about a dark window. Most of them have never heard of Walter Pruitt. That's all right. The rule was never that you'd save somebody. It was only ever this, that on the day it matters, somebody looks up at your porch, and if it's dark, they come. That night, if Walter stayed with you, put a name in the comments, the person on your street whose light you'd check on this week. That's how it starts. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.